I think it's pretty clear to anyone who's paying attention that we live in a time of great crisis. Not only ecological crisis, although that's maybe the most obvious, but also economic crisis. For most people, the Great Recession is far from over. And also political crisis. I mean, I think the kind of stalemate we're seeing in Congress is reflecting a deepening kind of fragmentation or division in our sort of national consciousness. But that's not what I want to talk about here. You can add your own crisis to the mix. I would want to talk about what I think is another crisis that is much less obvious, but in a way might be even more important in the sense that it underlies these other crises. I mean, a story crisis. And by story, I mean our basic understanding of what the world is about, who we are, and how it is that we fit together. The basic problem is that we are now living a dysfunctional story, a story that isn't working very well, a story that actually doesn't correspond to the way the world actually is very well. And the real problem here, of course, is that we don't know it's a story. We tend to see through the story. We tend to think it's reality. And so we're not aware that there's other ways of understanding the world. And it may well be that we need to come to a new story if we're actually going to be able to resolve these other crises, the ecological, the economic, and political. And so that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the new story, which a number of different people have been talking about. I don't know whether, or writing about, thinking about. If you're not familiar with it and you want to pursue it, I'd suggest for a start a book by Thomas Berry and Brian Swim, The Universe Story. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it, but it's a great place to start. What doesn't seem to have been noticed so far is that although there are a number of slightly different versions, no one seems to have put it together with Buddhism. In fact, I think the fundamental teachings of Buddhism can actually help us appreciate and understand this story much more deeply, depending, of course, on how it is that we understand Buddhism, because I think the new story also challenges some of the, what you might call the Iron Age mythologies of traditional Buddhism. Mythologies, aspects that we really need to interrogate and rethink today. So that's what I propose to do. My story begins with Charles Darwin. When he published The Origin of Species, he basically refuted the last remaining proof for God's existence, the argument from design, the idea that some kind of supreme consciousness or intelligence was necessary to design these incredibly complex organisms that we and so many other animals are. So we can understand from that viewpoint, God not disappeared necessarily, but he certainly sort of tended to sort of disappear up into the clouds. And that's created a real problem, because traditionally God has been the source of meaning, value, and goodness for us. So when God disappeared, there was a kind of a godlike hole that was left. A godlike hole in a desacralized world that had lost the source of its meaning. We no longer had a binding moral code to determine how it is that we should live together. So the new secular universe that we've inherited from that, ruled by impersonal physical laws, is basically indifferent to us and our fate. And we have no role to play in it. We're basically accidents of the evolutionary process, random genetic modifications. And that is a lot of the problem, because unlike virtually every pre-modern culture where human beings, human society had a really important role to play in keeping the cosmos working, the universe isn't different to us. We're kind of an accident. And there's a lot of dukkha, a lot of collective dukkha built into that as far as how we understand what we're supposed to do, how it is that we're going to while away our time on this earth. In other words, if God was originally providing the old understanding of meaning and value and goodness, where are we going to get that? Because we still need it, right? We still need some answers to those questions. Where are we going to derive them? Well, pretty quickly, after Darwin published his book, his contemporary Herbert Spencer came out with what has become known as social Darwinism. And he basically tried to apply what Darwin had discovered, decided about the way that the natural world works, the way that evolution works, competition and so forth. And he said we can apply that to society. Society is the same kind of organism. He was the one who coined the term survival of the fittest and applied it to human society so that civilization came to be understood as another jungle environment where if you don't crawl over the next guy on your way to the top, he's going to crawl over you. The value and meaning of life were largely understood in terms of survival and maybe not so much reproductive, but financial success now. The basic unit of society is the individual. Conventional morality is just social conditioning. And basically life is all about what you can get and what you can get away with until you die. You're either a winner or a loser, and you don't want to be a loser. Winners deserve what they get. Losers deserve what they get. I think you can see the attraction of this to a certain number of people, especially those who are more successful, right? Most of us know very little. Maybe we haven't even heard the word Herbert Spencer, but he was actually the most influential, the most popular philosopher or intellectual, actually, public intellectual, that the United States has ever known. You literally can hardly overemphasize his impact on the late 19th century. And surprise, surprise, some of the people most influenced by him were the industrial tycoons, or, as we sometimes like to say, the robber barons. People like Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller. Carnegie, for example, in his autobiography, confessed how troubled he was by the collapse of Christian theology. And then he read Darwin and Herbert Spencer and said, quote, "I remember that light came as a flood and all was clear. Not only had I got rid of theology and the supernatural, I had found the truth of evolution." Well, I think we can understand why this was so attractive, because basically this also really helped to rationalize the kind of ruthless business practices that he engaged in, right? And an even better example, John D. Rockefeller described his ways of doing business as, again, survival of the fittest. And he actually gave a Sunday school sermon in which he compared the economic process to growing roses, which I guess he liked to do. And he said, in order for this one particular blossom to grow up and be biggest, most effulgent, most scentful, you have to snip off all the other buds around it. I'm not sure who he meant by the other little buds, whether that's his competitors or his employees. But I'm pretty sure I can guess who he understood to be the big, effulgent rose, right? Right? Now you may wonder, why am I talking so much about social Darwinism, something that no one ever talks about, even if they know about it today? The truth is, of course, if you're a social Darwinist, it's not necessarily wise to admit that you're a social Darwinist. Maybe you'll be more successful if you don't. But it's also true that social Darwinism is only one prime example of something that has a number of different reincarnations and continues to be very important in our society today. One really good example being the philosophy of Ayn Rand. Gore Vidal summarized her objectivism in a couple short phrases. What did he say? Altruism is the root of all evil. Self-interest is the only good. The point is, of course, Ayn Rand has become enormously influential among many libertarians and new conservatives. For example, Paul Rand, the vice presidential candidate for the Republicans in the last election, he's no relation to Ayn Rand, but he has actually said he was inspired to run for public office by her writings. And I think an even better example is Paul Greenspan, who, as head of the Fed, the Federal Reserve, for many years, was really the government's most important spokesman or supervisor over the economic process, right? Well, he was not only a student and a friend of Ayn Rand, but he said he reads Atlas Shrugged every year. Well, I don't know if you've tried. I've tried. I couldn't get through it once, so more power to him. But what does this say about the ideology, the worldview, the understanding of reality that's functioning at the top? From a Buddhist perspective, I think we can see pretty clearly that social Darwinism, in any of its incarnations, tends to rationalize some rather unsavory motivations, such as the three poisons that Buddhism traditionally focuses on as the roots of evil. Greed, aggression, and especially the delusion of separation, the delusion that I'm separate from you, and therefore I can, and for a social Darwinist, I should pursue my own well-being indifferent to or even at the cost of your well-being. This is something I'm going to constantly come back to, because I think this is really at the heart of the worldview that has become so problematical today. I mean, many sociologists have pointed out that social Darwinism of Spencer's understanding, the idea that society is a sort of Darwinist jungle, that just doesn't work. I mean, the whole point of society is that we know that if we don't like the way it's structured, we can restructure it to make it more socially just, which we've done in a number of ways. But in one very important way, social Darwinism, in whatever form, in a way it doesn't matter whether it's objectively true or not. The point is, if you have a lot of powerful, influential people who believe in social Darwinism and they act according to social Darwinism, what happens? In a way, our society is reconstructed and it becomes a kind of social Darwinist jungle. And of course, the interesting question is that the kind of society that we live in today? How much has that happened? Remember Gordon Gekko in Wall Street? Greed is good. Now, of course, social Darwinism is not the beginning of greed or anything like that. But what is a matter of great concern is how much this helps to rationalize this rather unsavory motivation from a Buddhist standpoint, how much it actually ends up justifying it. And I really wonder how much we can understand our society now, what's happening at the top levels of economics, at the top levels of the political system. And really, are they two systems or aren't they really sort of two parts of the same system these days? Can we understand what's going on here? And even internationally, the kind of social Darwinist competition among nations. Can we understand this unless we see something like this ideology functioning? If this is true, if this is problematical, what's the solution? Should we simply give up something like social Darwinist understanding, whatever form that may take, for a traditional Buddhist worldview, a traditional Buddhist story? Well, Buddhism certainly has a lot to offer, as I'm going to be going into, but we also need to recognize that Buddhism originated in Iron Age India, and inevitably it tends to share in the kind of mythologies that were very popular at that time. For example, if you read the Pali Canon, the earliest Buddhist text that we have, there are all kinds of stories about disincarnate spirits and gods, some of whom the Buddha talks to. For example, there's one story where a tree spirit complains to the Buddha that its tree has been cut down. There's another story where the Buddha hovers in midair over a river in order to stop two armies from fighting each other. And another one where, after a debate with a non-Buddhist, he suddenly rises up into the air and sort of zooms off. Actually, my favorite example is supposedly the way the Abhidharma, the third part of the Tripitaka, the Pali Canon, originated. Supposedly, the Buddha taught it. He ascended up into Tushita heaven and taught it to his mother there, which I find... I know a lot of professional philosophers and Buddhologists who find the Abhidharma rather difficult, so I'm just sort of curious what his mother made of it, right? So I think we can see pretty clearly the solution isn't simply taking the Buddhist worldview, the Buddhist paradigm, and exchanging that. But rather, what we really need now is a conversation between the best of the Western tradition, and particularly it has to take into account science. Any new story, I think, really has to start with what we've discovered. In particular, it's discovered about things like cosmology and evolution. And then we need to bring that into conversation with the most important Buddhist teachings about the causes of suffering, about awakening, about impermanence, insubstantiality, and emptiness, and all that sort of thing. So that's what I propose to do. It's interesting, isn't it, that so many religions have a real problem with evolution because it really sort of threatens their origin stories, their creation stories. But actually Buddhism, with this emphasis on impermanence and so forth, really doesn't have a problem. And that's why I think we will see how well the basic Buddhist perspective fits into this new story that I now want to present a little bit. Okay, so far, does this make sense? This is all kind of setting it up. Now going into the heart of this new story. Let me just say a little bit about that, and then I'll bring in the Buddhist perspective on it. Brian Swimme, the cosmologist, has said that the most important scientific discovery ever made is that if you leave hydrogen gas alone for 14 billion years, plus or minus a few 100 million years, quote, it turns into rose bushes, giraffes, and humans. Interesting. Is that also perhaps a very important spiritual story? Because the real question here, isn't it, is if hydrogen gas does that, what does that say about the true nature of hydrogen gas? There's an old Native American story, or tale, that talks about three great miracles. The first miracle is that anything exists. And if you think about it, that's a pretty big miracle, right? The second miracle is that living things exist. And the third miracle is that living things exist that know they exist. What I find amazing is how well this maps or parallels with the three stages of the evolutionary process. I mean, usually we distinguish cosmology from biological evolution, from cultural evolution. But what if we look at them together? One sort of sweep and ask, what's going on here, right? So we start out with the Big Bang, or as some people call it, the Great Flaring Forth, right? Originally, what do you have? Well, you have mostly hydrogen, a little bit of helium, lithium, and how over millions and millions of years, slowly, those enormous clouds condense into stars, and in the cores of stars, the hydrogen is fused to make the heavier elements. Heavier elements like carbon, oxygen, silicon, all the other ones I can't remember right now that are so important for life. And then later the stars and the superstars, the large stars, the supernovas, they explode and they scatter these higher elements, which are necessary for life. And then you get secondary solar systems like ours, where, again, there's a secondary coalescing, and you get a planet that therefore has the possibility, it has the elements that it needs in order for carbon-based life to evolve. And that's the second stage. So you get sort of the arising of organisms that are able to reproduce themselves and also to evolve until you finally get to primates and humans, and that's the third stage of evolution, cultural evolution, which is necessary in order to create higher forms, higher beings, such as the Buddha, or Einstein, or Gandhi, somebody like that. So here's the question. Here's the new story question. What's really going on here? And again, keeping those three together, not three separate things that we normally study them as, but looking at the whole sweep. What's going on? Well, traditionally, of course, there's two big answers. I mean, theists, people who believe in God, they think that there's some outside intelligence. If they believe in evolution at all, they believe in sort of some external consciousness that's directing it. At the same time, the received materialist paradigm understands it as basically, well, especially in the case of biological evolution, it's simply a result of random chance haphazard genetic mutations that somehow become more suitable for that particular environment, leading to greater reproductive success. But basically, it's chance, it's random, there's no meaning to it. I find it very interesting how this choice between God and matter reproduces this troublesome duality in the Western tradition that we've had for so long. The duality between mind and matter, right? It's got to be either mind or matter. If it's mind, well, it's the mind of God. If it's matter, matter evolves to a certain complexity, and then it becomes somehow self-conscious, aware. Other cultures don't have this duality in quite the same way. If you think about something like a chi or ki in China, or prana in India, they don't seem caught up in it. And so the question is there a third alternative? Is there another way of understanding what's going on here? According to the evolutionary biologist, very eminent, Theodore Dobzhansky, evolution is neither random nor determined, but, wait for it, creative. And another pretty distinguished biologist, Elizabeth Sahtouris, said something very similar. She said, evolution is an intelligent improvisational dance. Mm-hmm. What makes the dance intelligent is not that there's a dancing master outside it who decides the steps and rehearses and all that. Rather, but the dance itself evolves as the participants, the dancers, find new moves. So there's a kind of improvisational quality that expresses a different kind of an intelligence that's not imposed from outside, but as built into the process itself. In other words, the cosmos self-organizes. And that's really maybe the most important term. This is the new conception that the cosmos doesn't need something outside it, and it's not simply mechanical. You know, the old received materialistic reductionistic paradigm is that, you know, again, there's simply this, that there's a bunch of laws that organize things kind of like a machine. And maybe that's an important term to look at for a minute. The old paradigm that really the universe is like a machine. Actually, if you look at it closely, that metaphor doesn't really work very well. Let's do a little thought experiment quickly. If I can ask you, please close your eyes just for a second and think of a machine. Any machine. Now, most of us are geeks, so it's probably a computer, right? But whatever machine it was, I'm pretty sure that in addition to the machine, there was somebody outside the machine, something, some creator that designed the machine, built it, and maintains it. In other words, the basic concept, the basic metaphor of a machine is built around the idea that there is something outside the machine, which worked back in the old days when that metaphor was first evolving. But in fact, because in those days, everyone knew it was God. God was the one who created the universe as a kind of a machine and also created the laws whereby it works. But think of it this way. If you have a machine that is constantly transforming, evolving, creating more complicated parts out of itself, it's not a machine. That metaphor doesn't work. In fact, a much better metaphor would be to call it an organism. What happens if we look upon the universe, the cosmos, as an organism? In other words, does that mean that the cosmos is alive? So instead of reducing biology to a kind of physics, a physicalistic, mechanistic metaphor, paradigm, what if we turn the other way around and we understand as our basic paradigm this organic, biological one, right? According to the philosopher Ervin Laszlo, this new emerging paradigm also happens to be the traditional pre-modern paradigm. He says, quote, "At the cutting edge of contemporary science, a remarkable insight is surfacing. The universe with all things in it is a quasi-living, coherent whole. All things are connected, And a cosmos that's connected, coherent, and whole recalls an ancient notion present in every other pre-modern tradition. It's an enchanted cosmos. We are part of each other and of nature. We are a conscious part of the world, and wait for it, a being through which the cosmos comes to know itself. We are at home in the universe. If we are, in fact, a being through which the cosmos comes to know itself, then the cosmos is something more than our home. We're an integral part of it in a more profound way. We could understand ourselves as a kind of organ, then, of the cosmos, which raises the question, organs in our body, they have functions. What is our function? I mean, are we starting to see the possibilities here that we're not just accidents of the evolutionary process, but we actually might have a role to play? The fascinating implication of this new paradigm, then, is that we can understand evolution in the broadest sense as the creative groping of a self-organized cosmos, self-organizing cosmos that is becoming more self-aware and perhaps wants to become more self-aware. In the Universe story, this book by Barry and Swim, they make this point much more poetically than I can. Quote, "The mind that searches for contact with the Milky Way is the very mind of the Milky Way galaxy in search of its own inner depths." In other words, maybe if you go out late at night, you look up at the stars, wonder, what it's all about. Well, us, these beings that have been created, that are looking up at the Milky Way, we are in fact products of the Milky Way. It's the Milky Way looking up at itself and wondering what it's all about. What does this imply about somebody like Walt Whitman admiring a beautiful sunset? Again, quoting from their book. Walt Whitman is a space the Milky Way fashioned to feel its own grandeur. Instead of our eyes being the result of chance mutations, can we see them as created by the cosmos in order to perceive itself, right? This is where things get really interesting from a Buddhist perspective, and it's also we're going to have a little break in the sense that we're going to have a 1-minute musical interlude. I'm aware this is really heady stuff, right? And it would be lovely if I could figure out a way to bring more humor into this, or even figure out a good way to put it into slides. But in fact, I'm inspired by the music that we had yesterday from our Bay Area yoga teacher. I really liked the way she used music. And I thought, well, okay, this is like the critical point of the talk. Maybe if we have just a little bit of music to set up. Ready? Okay, Kelly? Thank you. So that's the setup, the Buddhist setup, right? And here's the really interesting question. The understanding of ourselves as the way in which the cosmos comes to know of self, right? Does this help to answer the age-old Buddhist question, if there's no self, who becomes enlightened? Who awakens? Is the answer to that, in some profound sense, that it's the universe itself? After his own awakening, the 12th century Japanese Zen master Dogen Keegan, his awakening happened when his teacher said, mind and body must fall away. You must let go mind and body. And he was able to do that. And afterwards he described his awakening in the following way. I came to realize clearly that mind is no other than mountains and rivers and the great wide earth, the sun and the moon and the stars. According to a Mahayana teaching, Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha, became enlightened when he looked up from his meditations under the Bodhi tree and he saw the morning star, Venus, whereupon he declared, I am awakened together with the whole of the great earth and all its beings. Not that everyone else became enlightened as he did, but in a sense, the whole cosmos was becoming enlightened through him. Did the Buddha suddenly awaken, suddenly realize his non-duality with that star and with everything else? There's a beautiful poem by Rumi, a very short one I'd like to quote, which is from a different tradition, which is really helpful because it reminds us that this Dharma is not the exclusive possession of Buddhism. Rumi has this wonderful little poem called The Worm Awakes. This is how a human being can change. There's a worm addicted to eating grape leaves. Suddenly, he wakes up. Call it grace, whatever, something wakes him, and he's no longer a worm. He's the entire vineyard, and the orchard too, the fruit, the trunks, a growing wisdom and joy that doesn't need to devour. What's going on there? To awaken is to realize, and remembering the Buddhist critique of the Buddhist emphasis on anatta, no self. What does that mean? As I see it, as I understand it, the notion that there's a me here inside, somehow inside my head, behind the eyes, looking out at you, the sense of separation between this. This is the fundamental duality. Rather, I and each one of us is not inside looking out, but rather each of us is one of the countless ways in which the whole cosmos, all the causes and conditions are coming together right here and now. This is beautifully expressed by Nisargadatta, a Vedantin, who put it better than anyone else when he said, when I look inside and see that I am nothing, that's wisdom. When I look outside and see that I am everything, that's love. Between these two, my life turns. Does this make any sense? I think you can see how the basic claims of the new story might fit very well into the Buddhist understanding and how the Buddhist understanding can actually help us here. And I wonder if this can also help us understand the sense in which we are special. And this is a big issue because there's this big controversy, I think really in Buddhism and in a lot of other circles as well, whether we are, like the Bible says, we're special, we're superior to other species. Whether we believe that or not, we certainly act that way, don't we? We abuse them and abuse them. Or whether we're the species just like any other species. And in a way, I think from a Buddhist perspective, we can say that they're both true. Right? If you want to talk about form as emptiness, emptiness is this word that scares everybody, but basically it means things are empty of any self-existence, any reality, any being of their own, because everything is interconnected, everything is dependent upon everything else. What this means is, from that perspective, nothing is any more valuable, nothing has any superiority over anything else. Everything is a manifestation, a lacking nothing manifestation of the whole. And yet, we can also see, if we look at the other side, if we look at emptiness as form, and we look at forms, and of course we can understand that there's evolution, there's progress, complexity, and greater consciousness, right? From one cell to multi-celled creatures, from reptiles to mammals to primates to human beings, and also to the fact that we seem to be the species that has the ability to wake up and realize that we are the cosmos. And what's important about that? And it's not simply that we have that ability. It goes further than that, it seems to me. If we understand the cosmos as this fundamentally creative process, transforming, creating all these new things all the time, then with us, new types of creativity become possible that wouldn't become possible. And we call it culture, human culture. So if the concern is to understand how the universe is constantly creating and creating more things that can flourish, with us, new types of flourishing become possible that wouldn't otherwise be available there. It's almost as if we become centers, autonomous centers of creativity that can sort of bring the creative process to heights of development that wouldn't be possible without us. What do I mean? Human culture transforms eating into growing food, cooking, and elegant dining. We transform procreation into romance, weddings, marriage, children, love, right? We transform grunts, communicative grunts, bird calls, into language, literature, philosophy, dharma, and so many other types of storytelling. New possibilities. We transform birdsong into symphonies. And we also create new species, many new species, by which I mean things like, well, originally hand axes, knives and wells, bridges, houses and roads, temples and cathedrals, string quartets and jazz quartets, oil portraits, marble statues, schools, economic systems, political institutions, scientific research, computers, the internet, and new types of internet-based communities. In other words, the cosmos becomes incredibly richer in creative and flourishing possibilities. I remember William Blake said, "Eternity is in love with the productions of time." And maybe from a Buddhist perspective, we can say the cosmos is in love with the forms that emptiness takes. Which is important because sometimes we get stuck on the form as emptiness. We're too much focused on realizing the emptiness, realizing the quiet, empty place, and minimize the fact that the emptiness is a kind of a generative ground from which all of these transformations, all of these creative things can arise. Right? And one of the most important things that I think we create is new dimensions of meaning. And this is going to bring us back full circle to this whole question about, according to the old story, our lives are meaningless. The world is just kind of a machine that runs along according to these laws that really don't have any special meaning to them. The physicist Steven Weinberg, he has said that the more we comprehend the universe, the more it appears pointless. That's an interesting notion, but I find it something puzzling. The person who says that, is he something outside the universe? Or is he, in fact, a product, a manifestation of the universe, in which case it's the universe itself observing itself? And even being able to observe and comprehend itself in that way, doesn't that in some way change the universe? The fact that it's the universe able to come to this understanding? Does doing that change the universe? Certainly it changes us. And in that way, it changes the universe because we're part of it, right? You could say that we come to see the universe in a new way. If that happens, the universe is coming to see itself in a new way. What does that mean? What does that really imply? Well, getting back to this whole question of meaning and role, I think it has enormous implications, right? One of the things we know from our Buddhist practice is that as human beings, and maybe this is distinct for us as human beings, we have this ability to disidentify or to let go, right? So when we're meditating, we're letting go of thoughts, we're letting go of the things that we're normally attached to. And this is something that happens not only individually, but in the sense we're also letting go of our collective selves. So, in other words, I can let go of the idea of patriarchy, that I'm a man and separate and superior to women, or I can let go of the idea of nationalism, that I'm an American and therefore somehow different from or better than the Chinese, racism, that I'm white and not African American, that I'm a human and not some other lower species. So there's all these kinds of letting go that are going on. But why do we do this? It's not because we want to dissociate from all of the whole. Rather, it's just the opposite. We let go of these kind of dualities, one side of the dualities, because in a way what we're doing is opening up and learning to identify with the whole, right? To say that we are the way that the universe wakes up, that we are the way that the cosmos knows itself. It's really saying that there's an important sense in which the cosmos becomes our own body, and especially the biosphere, right? So what does this mean? What does this imply about the meaning of our lives? Something very important, I think. We, as a species, have the opportunity, and maybe at this point in our history, it's the necessity to come to not only identify with the whole, but to take responsibility for the whole. We are the one species that can say the meaning of our lives is tied up with the fact that we take responsibility for the well-being of the whole biosphere. In other words, a kind of new understanding of the bodhisattva path, which I think has always been sort of pointing in that direction. As a Zen student, we recited the four bodhisattva vows. The first one, living beings are numberless, I vow to save them all, right? Pretty big job, right? But it's the notion that as a bodhisattva, we can understand the meaning of our lives. We have this opportunity to understand the meaning of our lives as being devoted to the well-being of the whole. I think that's huge, right? I think I can see that. You can see how that is the other side of waking up and realizing we are the whole. How are we going to live in a way that's compatible with that realization? It's to take responsibility. With us, the universe, the cosmos, has evolved a being, a species, that can not only realize we are the whole, come to self-awareness, but we also take responsibility. We choose to accept responsibility for the well-being of the whole. Does this answer this whole old question about the meaning of our lives and what it's all about? It's interesting how the bodhisattva path fits in here, and how I think this gives us a different perspective on it. You know, the old mythological idea of the bodhisattva, according to one story, the bodhisattva is somebody who can sort of, he or she is so enlightened, they could disappear up in nirvana, but instead they choose, out of compassion, to stick around and help the rest of us. Very strange. It's like it's to their own best interest to go to nirvana, but they choose to sacrifice. I don't think that really captures what's going on. Remembering what Nisargadatta said, as we begin to wake up and realize that, I'm not in here separate from you, but rather I'm all of this, that this is my mind, as Dogen said, then it seems to be a natural further stage of practice. As we become less self-preoccupied, less concerned with our own dukkha, less introverted, less narcissistic, so we naturally start to open up and we work for the betterment of everyone. Or to put it this way, if I'm non-dual with all of you, how can I be fully enlightened unless all of you are enlightened as well? And this, it seems to me, is the situation we're in today. This is the challenge. It's almost as if I think we're being challenged at this point in history to wake up in this fashion or get out of the way. It's not going to be easy. We know that we have some very serious problems, right? We have an ecological crisis that threatens the future of nature and of societies for our children, for our descendants. We know that we're also, our creativity is so boundless. And yet just in the last century or so, we've created 2 world wars, holocausts, genocides, so many weapons of mass destruction, huge nuclear repositories and stockpiles and so forth. So the whole point about our creativity is that there's 2 sides to it. We're able to create pretty awful things too, as well as wonderful things. And the danger is that if we continue to be motivated, and this is where it comes back to Buddhism, if we continue to be motivated from the delusion of self, not only individual sense of self, but collective sense of self, if we continue to think, okay, I'm going to work for the well-being of me or the well-being of we at the cost of the rest of the world, if we're still caught up at that level of duality, that level of delusion, it's pretty likely that we're not going to be able to resolve the kinds of situations that we've gotten ourselves into here. So what needs to be done so that our creative powers will promote collective well-being, collective in this case referring to the whole of the biosphere? The German philosopher Nietzsche said that man, excuse his gendered language, man is a rope stretched between the animal and the overman or the superman. We're a rope across an abyss. What's great in us is that we're a bridge and not a goal. In other words, are we transitional? Must we evolve further in order to survive at all? If so, what's needed is not a new biological species, but we're talking about a new stage in cultural evolution. And what type of cultural evolution is called for? Well, from a Buddhist perspective, we can see the fundamental problem is not so much ethical, but cognitive in the deepest sense. As I was trying to say, this delusion of separation. In other words, the basic problem is not really what you might call self-love, but a profound misunderstanding of what our true self really is. Without the compassion that arises when we realize our non-duality, empathy not only with other people, but with the whole of the biosphere, right? It's not only possible, but likely that civilization as we know it won't survive the next century or 2, nor would it deserve to. Can we see then that the ecological crisis is also a spiritual crisis? To conclude, perhaps exemplars like the Buddha and Gandhi, they're harbingers or prototypes of how our species needs to develop, in which case the cultural developments that are most needed today, the kind of growing tip of the whole evolutionary process, might be what's going on when we're meditating. Because, as we've been hearing, these new discoveries in the plasticity of the brain, it's quite fascinating. When we're meditating, it's not as though we are transforming ourselves. Rather, it's like the ego is getting out of the way so that the brain can restructure and rewiring itself. What's really going on there? Again, can we understand this as like the growing tip of the whole evolutionary process? Spiritual practices that seem necessary because they promote more than anything else, helping us get beyond the delusion of a self, a separate self, whose well-being can be distinguished from that of others. So the real issue becomes, I think, is whether our species will wake up enough to become the collective bodhisattva of the biosphere. I'm reminded of something Thich Nhat Hanh wrote recently. I'm sure you've heard of it. The next Buddha may appear as a Sangha, as a community. That we don't just need another Buddha or another Gandhi. We need Sanghas that develop and evolve and mature and become awakened in this way. And in this way, we're also challenged to discover the meaning and the role that we seek, which the old story doesn't give us. The old story, life is meaningless, might as well become consumers, what else is there to do until we die? But here we're challenged to discover a new meaning, a new role in the ongoing long-term task of repairing the biosphere, repairing the rupture between us and Mother Earth. For this, of course, we need this new kind of story. We need this more therapeutic paradigm about what it means to be a human being in the 21st century. A paradigm that I think the new story is moving toward and that Buddhism can certainly contribute to. If we embrace this new story and if we do our best to live it, it seems pretty clear that the healing that's going to happen will transform our own species, our own societies, as much as the rest of the biosphere. That's all. Thank you very much.